You must obey your Nagus! Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for the Nagus, which is episode 10 of season 1 of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, one episode at a time. In this video, I cover the first season episode, the Nagus. So the Nagus is the episode where the Ferengi ruler, known as the Grand Nagus, comes on board the station and uses Quark Spar to have a very important meeting with a lot of the important Ferengi leaders, and there he announces a plan to spread business interests into the Gamma Quadrant. He then announced that he will not actually lead these endeavors, that he is going to announce a new successor to become Grand Nagus so he can retire, and the successor to everyone's outrage is Quark. So Quark becomes the new Grand Nagus and starts to do a pretty good job. However, after several assassination attempts on his life, it becomes apparent that Zek's son, Krax, is working with Rom, who's upset with Quark because he won't give him the bar, to assassinate Quark. However, before they can pull out their next assassination attempt, Odo reveals that the Grand Nagus Zek is actually still alive. He just faked his death in order to test his son Krax to see if he was ready to take power, and he failed the test miserably. So Zek resumes his position as Grand Nagus, and Quark goes back to running his bar and gives Rom a promotion for having the lobes to try to assassinate him. So, it's funny because I watched a couple reviews, one in particular that said that this episode felt like a fresh breath air after the previous episode, Move Along Home, that it was like a relief and much better. Actually, several reviews said that, and it's funny because I think the opposite. I know we've already established I have very unpopular views on Move Along Home, and my views differ from the vast majority. Not in case you don't realize, if you're finding my channel for the first time, it's not that I love that episode, I just don't hate it. I think it's fine. Where I wouldn't say I hate this episode either, but I do think it's a downgrade. And it's funny because I had that exact reaction. I'm like, oh, so we went to a fun, enjoyable watch to this Drek. Now, again, not that I hate this episode, but this is kind of what I feel like when I look at season 1 and I look for prime examples of the feel of season 1. Not to say the worst of season 1. As I said, we'll get to that towards the end of the season. But to sort of sum up the mediocre, kind of poor feeling of maybe dullness of season 1, and I think this exemplifies that for me. It's not a terrible episode, but it's kind of goofy and silly in the way later seasons of Deep Space Nine isn't, even the Ferengi episodes. But I'll talk more about the Ferengi episodes later. But it has that kind of goofiness and dullness and mediocre feeling that I think really exemplifies what season 1 of Deep Space Nine was. And so, yeah, I think this was a clear downgrade. It's not nearly as fun as Move Along Home with all its amazing moments and great quotes. So, yes, I mean, and I talked about in my revisited for Move Along Home that I don't think it's so bad it's good, because all what I find funny and enjoyable was intentional humor. It wasn't, in order to be considered so bad it's good, it should be unintentional humor. But I think the parts I laughed at and the parts I enjoyed were intentional. They were meant to be funny. Whereas the jokes in this episode, I just, like, found them goofy and not particular. I mean, there were a few moments, to be fair, that got some giggles from me, such as when I just laughed thinking about it. When Cisco's talking to Quark in the infirmary. Is it the infirmary? Yeah, in the infirmary after his first assassination attempt. And Cisco goes to talk to Quark and says, "No, listen, Quark." And then Brahm just pops up out of nowhere and goes, Grand Nagus, Quark. And Cisco just gives him this really super annoyed look, like, get the fuck out of here. Like, so that was funny. That was like good comic timing. But most of the other stuff in this episode, the stuff with the Nagus and the Ferengis acting all greedy and, oh, look at how funny they're like greedy. Yeah, that stuff falls flat for me. And so this actually gets into the larger point about Ferengi episodes, because they have to do one, sometimes even two. Actually, I think it'll become the norm to do at least two Ferengi episodes a season. Now, let me be clear. There is a distinction, as I'll get to as we go through the episodes of Deep Space Nine, from Quark episodes to Ferengi episodes, because Quark episodes can actually be pretty good. I'm thinking of episodes like House of Quark or Business as Usual. But there's a clear distinction for me from Quark episodes to Ferengi episodes. Now, sometimes the line can be blurry, because sometimes Quark episodes can feature other Ferengi, such as Business as Usual had his cousin Gala or whatever in it. But when I think of Ferengi episodes, I think specifically of episodes that are about Ferengi, like, for example, if they go to Ferenginar, or if it's I don't even consider Body Parts a Ferengi episode. That's more of a Quark episode, because that does feature Brunt, but really it's about Quark, and it's not really about, and it does have some aspects of Ferengi culture, but it's not like specifically focused on the Ferengi. Like anything with Grand Nagus Zek is a Ferengi episode, like stuff like the Rules of Acquisition in season 2, and stuff that just have a whole bunch of Ferengi and focus specifically on Ferengi. That's what I consider a Ferengi episode, and not just a Quark episode. And because there's, as I said, there's some good and decent and okay Quark episodes, but as far as Ferengi episodes go, there's one good one, which is one of my favorite episodes of Deep Space Nine, maybe top 20, top 30. That's over in season 6. You know the one. It's the funniest episode in the Star Trek franchise. But other than that one good, actually funny Ferengi episode, all the other ones suck. Now, okay, to be fair, there's a couple that are just okay, like Rules of Acquisition in season 2 and Profit Motive in season 3. I thought were okay. Like, those are decent. They were kind of humorous. But the majority of the Ferengi episodes are just not good. They're simply not good, and they kind of started to get worse. With that one exception I mentioned in season 6, they started to get worse in later seasons. Now, this one I wouldn't say sucked or was completely terrible. Certainly not one of the worst Ferengi episodes. This one was also kind of okay, but more in the sort of, because the Profit Motive and Rules of Acquisition were kind of okay in like a positive sense, where this was okay in a negative sense. That it wasn't completely offensive and annoying to watch, like actively unfunny. When I use the term actively unfunny, I mean not just as not funny, but the jokes are actually annoying, and so it's like actively unfunny. It's not like a neutral unfunny. It's like a net negative unfunny. Like, I would have been better off. Like, the jokes actively make my life worse. Or my enjoyment, I should say, not sound so hyperbolic, but it makes my enjoyment of what I'm watching worse. And this episode is actively unfunny. And Ferengi episodes, yeah, tend to be actively unfunny. getting to the worst episode of the entire Star Trek franchise, by the way, also in season 6, ironically, is the worst Ferengi episode, is the worst episode of the entire franchise, because, oh my, not only is that actively unfunny, like to the extreme actively unfunny, but it's also offensive and just terribly written. But anyway, I'm not here to talk about that shit show. I'm here to talk about this, the one that kicked off that shit show and introduced the Grand Nagus. Now here's the thing, I love Wallace Shawn. I think he's a great actor, and it was interesting that he played a recurring character in Deep Space Nine. But it's funny, I did not recognize him at all. When my sister first told me that, hey, that's the same guy from Princess Bride, the inconceivable guy, and I didn't believe her. I was like, no, that's not him. And she was like, yeah, of course it is. You recognize his voice. And the thing is, I still don't really recognize his... I can, like, on certain words recognize his voice, but he's putting on a different kind of voice than he normally does. A little bit, like it's more nasally. It sounds just a little different. Of course, with all that heavy makeup on, I can't recognize his face or him visually. But she was saying the voice gives it away, and I've heard a lot of other people say that. And actually, like, if you listen to certain words, yeah, you can make the connection. But I still say that is not obvious. I still say, I can anticipate some people thinking I'm dumb or silly for not instantly recognizing him. But I still say that he's not instantly recognizable in this role. Even by his voice, it does sound a little bit different. But anyway, so I usually love Wallace Shawn. Like, for example, when he did a voice in Toy Story, like the dinosaur or whatever it was, like, I recognize his voice immediately. Like, oh, Wallace Shawn, instantly. But here, he does something with his voice that it makes it sounds a bit different than his normal voice. But anyway, yeah, I think he's a really good actor. But it's not the acting that bothers me about the Grand Nagus, it's the writing. Now here's the thing. When I was, I guess when season 6 and 7 were out, I used to read this online review website called the Cynic's Corner that he was very cynical about. So it was during seasons 6 and 7 of DS9, which will also be season 4 and season 4 and 5 of Voyager. And actually he kept going with that website all the way up until, I believe, season 1 of Enterprise. But then, like most people, got sick of that crappy show and gave up. So yeah, I remember a lot of things that he would say, and one thing in particular that's really stuck with me, and it just keeps floating through my mind as I watch this episode, and I imagine every episode with the Nagus, this will come to mind. He always referred to Zek as the Grand Dingus. So that's what I always think of him, as the Grand Dingus, rather than the Grand Nagus. But anyway, my issue, I mean, it seems the joke is, oh, look at how cruel they are. Look at how greedy they are. They're greediest to an absurd degree, which this kind of gets into, is kind of similar to a lot of people continuously point out that The Onion is not really funny anymore because reality has become just as absurd as The Onion used to be. And that's kind of how I feel about the Grand Nagus of the Ferengi. That reality, they're like, look at how absurd and extreme their greed and I'm like, but nowadays, like, I believe that's almost become a reality. It's not almost even absurd anymore. And I don't know. There's just something about, I know it's supposed to be a statement on the pitfalls of capitalism, but I think because our Stephen Bear kind of takes over for the Ferengi and in Deep Space Nine, and he doesn't get Roddenberry's vision, and I think he doesn't. I think he kind of morphs the particular message or the satire of the Ferengi in a way which sometimes, don't get me wrong, sometimes I still agree with and I still think it makes sense. But I believe, and let's be fair, the original concept of the Ferengi was a complete and utter failure, which is why they dropped them for a while and then eventually turned them into jokes. But I believe that the original concept of the Ferengi was to be actually, I don't believe it was outright stated. It was meant to be criticism on Wall Street greed. But instead, they turned it into more of an over-the-top goofball exaggeration of, like, used car salesman. That's the stereotype. But, the kind of greedy, slimy, over-the-top goofball salesman types, that archetype or that stereotype, but pump it up to, like, 1,000 and then make an entire society of just those people and what the society would be like. And so it no longer really... It no longer becomes, not that it ever was, to be honest, but to be fair, but it no longer becomes a criticism on the pitfalls of capitalism. Because I was watching one of the reviews and they were like, well, I don't really see, it's supposed to be a commentary on capitalism and the pitfalls of it, but I don't really see how it is. And that's because I don't think it is anymore, because I don't think Ira Steven Behr got that or understood that message. Now, as I said, there's some specific aspects of later episodes that I think will actually be effective criticisms in that regard, but for the most part, like this episode in particular, doesn't come off that way at all. It's just like, oh, isn't it funny how goofball they are and how over the top they're being? Oh, they're so goofy. It's like a whole society of used car salesmen, which to me that loses any substance. That loses, because to make a criticism on the pitfalls of capitalism is a worthwhile commentary, one that I'm very interested in, and if it was done right, I think it could be powerful or thoughtful. But that's not what this is, and that's not what most Ferengi episodes are. This is simply, oh, look at how goofy and silly they are being because their greed is so over the top. And again, if this wasn't so close to reality, maybe I would find that funny, but I don't. It's just kind of annoying, and I don't know. And a lot of the humor that they try to do, I just think falls really flat. And mainly because they're just telling the same joke over and over again. And worse, like all the Ferengi episodes, most of them will keeping to repeat the same joke over and over again in different ways, and be like, oh, you have to walk up the stairs, you have to pay someone, look at how greedy they are, oh, they, and look at how misogynistic they are, but they just repeat those same things in different ways. They just drill in the same point over and over and over again. They're super greedy, they're super selfish, they're super misogynistic, yeah, we just get it, and every single joke just repeats and drills in those same beats over and over again, and it gets old and it gets tired. And I think it's old even in this episode, even self-contained in this one episode. That joke of, oh, look at how greedy and selfish they are, boom boom, hit repeat, hit repeat. It just is not funny. I'm sorry. And so that's why I don't like the Grand Nagus in particular, because that seems to be his thing, that he's like the greediest of the greedy, and everything he does is like super greedy and selfish. That's, by the way, one of the reasons why I actually like the episode Profit Motive, which I'll get to later, because a lot of people seem to hate that, but I much prefer that episode to ones like this, because that spins the whole concept on his head, that instead of being super greedy, he becomes super nice. So at least plays with the idea a little bit, whereas episodes like this just hammer, hit, and beat the dead horse with the same point over and over and over again, which I just don't find funny and actually find a little bit annoying. More than a little bit, to be fair. And that's why I don't like the Grand Nagus in particular, because there's no substance to him. He's just a walking over the top stereotype that is I just find annoying. As much as I love Wallace Shawn, it's not his fault, it's the writing's fault, as I said. So, a couple things about the storyline with Quark becoming Grand Nagus. The bigger thing, and this is, of course, a bigger issue with the other episode that I'm going to talk about, but they repeat this storyline in the penultimate episode, Dogs of War, which is meant to wrap up the entire Ferengi plot, and it does it within a subplot. It's not even the main plot of the episode. And it repeats the same storyline of Quark becoming Grand Nagus. Now, in that case, it just turns out to be a misunderstanding. He actually meant Rom. Spoilers. But in this case, it was a ploy to try to train his son Krax to learn how to become Nagus. So you could say, oh, well, two different things, but they're too similar. And the thing that really annoyed me about that plot in Dogs of War was that they didn't acknowledge that this was already done. They could just throw in a line. It's like, hey, what about that other time you were Grand Nagus? But they were trying to pretend like this episode doesn't exist and pretend like they weren't actually just repeating a same story that they've already done. But anyway, as I said, that's more of a knock on that episode than it is on this one. But as for this one goes, okay, so I just thought of another funny moment. So I said the one with Ron popping out. There's another funny moment. To be totally fair, there's another funny moment in this episode, and that's when they're having that big meeting with all the Ferengi showing up and MORN. I just love MORN. This is like MORN's biggest episode so far, I think, because I think when I was watching it for the first time, this is the first time I really noticed him. Because he's in the background for every episode, but you don't tend to, at least for me, I don't really notice the background or the minutia that much. I pay more attention to the main characters in the story. And so I never really noticed him until this episode because they featured him prominently, because when he's having that big meeting, MORN shows up and tries to get in the bar, and Quark has to be like, go away, shoo! Which and that sort of gets to the point that he spends his entire life there. And they've all admitted, everyone attached to the show admitted that he was sort of an homage to Norm from Cheers, which is why his name rhymes with that. And that he's meant to be the barfly that always sticks at the bar. But I think this episode hammers that point home. And I think, as I said, it was the first time I actually noticed him, and I thought it was a funny scene because Quark had to close the bar for this big Ferengi meeting, and MORN just couldn't take that. He was like, "Well, this is my bar, though." And by the way, speaking of MORN, this is the only time we ever hear him make a sound, because at the start of the episode we see Quark telling him a joke and we hear him laughing. He never says a word on screen, but he laughs in this episode, so he does make a sound, I think for the only time. Anyways, I love MORN. But as far as this episode goes, so apparently they were doing a lot of homages to The Godfather, which I didn't notice because I never saw that movie. Don't at me. I never cared to see it. But anyway, for example, apparently the scene where Quark is acting as Nagus, and we have one of those Ferengi go to him and ask to introduce Synthahol to the Gamma Quadrant, and Quark's like, "Oh, were you happy when I was announced Nagus?" He was like, "No, Nagus." "And did you try to reach out and try to help me?" "No, Nagus." And then Quark drills that home, and he's like, I'll split the profits with you 50-50. And Quark's like, "Well, in that case, I hope the Gamma Quadrant has a taste for Synthahol." Apparently, that whole scene was taken right from The Godfather. which I'll have to take other people's words for it because I've never seen that movie. But that was interesting. But there are other parts of it that I definitely made it kind of obvious that it was having a mafia feel to it. But here's the... Alright, so before I get into the thing, the other thing that was very overtly mafia-like was the scene where Quark was first made Nagus, and you have that random Ferengi going up to him and being like, "Oh, I'm going to be your protection. I'll protect you." And Quark's like, "Oh, well, what if?" He's like, "Oh, protect me from whom? Those who would never like to hurt you and whatever. But I won't let them as long as you give me all this profit." Like, so it's a protection racket. Basically is what is referred to as that. The mafia would do that a lot. They say, "Oh, you give us this money to protect you," but if they don't give them the money, then they will destroy their store or whatever. So it's basically the same sort of thing. It's like, "Oh, you're going to give me all this profits or I'm going to kill you." And it was just a sly way of threatening that. But so let me get to the thing now. Here's the thing. As I said, the Ferengi are over the top, goofy caricatures or stereotypes, and so this is like the goofy mafia. It's the thing about the mafia, and I don't like mafia movies myself, to be honest, but the reason why a lot of people do is because they're like intimidating. It's intriguing. They're scary. Even like the ones that are kind of idiotic, like in Goodfellas, they're idiotic, but in a scary ass way because they'll kill you for the slightest little thing. And so it's very scary, intimidating. Tough guys, where these are just a bunch of idiotic goofballs, and so kind of, to me, that makes it even less interesting as a mafia analogy, because they're just a bunch of moronic, goofy, over the top, stereotype, cliche caricatures. So it makes the whole thing, it diminishes the whole thing and just makes it a stupid exercise. In the first place. Let's see if there's anything else to say about this Nagus storyline. I guess the thing about... Okay, I gotta talk about cracks, actually, because this is the first of two times in Deep Space Nine where they have introduced a main character who has a son, and they do it on the first episode. They introduced this, not a main character, a supporting character, a recurring character, and they always introduce their son with them in the first episode they're introduced. For the record, the other character I'm thinking of is Martok, so we'll see that later in season 4. And here it's the Grand Nagus, because they introduced the Grand Nagus' son, and the son will promptly disappear and be erased from existence after this episode. Never acknowledged that he even exists, and it's kind of like Remember Me scenario, where they're like, "What? I've never heard of this person." And as I said, they do that with Martok's son in season 4. You're like, Martok has a son? Yeah, he did in the first episode, but he is erased from existence after that episode. Just like Krax is going to be erased from existence. I mean, the least they could do is like mention him off screen and be like, or on screen mention like, "Oh yes, Krax died in the exploding Latinum incident," or something. I don't know. Just like something to mention why he's not around anymore. Like, "Oh, ever since Grand Nagus' son passed away, he's been sad," or something like that. Just tie up that storyline instead of like, "What? Krax? Who's that? Never heard of him." I think you're crazy thinking that Grand Nagus had a son. He never had a son, even though there's fucking video evidence that he did have a goddamn son. But they just, try to pretend like he never exists. And that is annoying. That is actually very annoying. Especially renders this episode worse, in my opinion, because the whole point of this episode is that Zek is trying to teach his son to be a better Nagus in order to eventually take his place. But then, since the sun's wiped from existence after this episode, like, who gives a fuck? And not only that, like in the Dogs of War episode I mentioned where he makes Brahm the Grand Nagus, well, like, why the fuck didn't he make his son the Grand Nagus? Because the sun no longer exists. He was wiped. Maybe Q or someone just wiped him from existence. Anyway, that's so dumb. So, I guess we'll talk about the B plot now. And I thought the B plot was okay. It was, I must admit, it was kind of a heartwarming moment where, you know, because throughout the episode, Cisco's thinking, oh, you know, Nog's a bad influence on Jake. He's up to no good and he's staying up late and getting into trouble. But he goes and spies on him and finds out that he's actually teaching Nog how to read. And then, so it was kind of heartwarming. And when Cisco goes to Jake and is like, oh, you're a good boy. And he's like very happy. And it's like, oh, go be with your friend now. Like, so it's kind of heartwarming. But here's the thing about this whole B plot. It kind of reads exactly like an after-school special. And in fact, I'm sure there were like after-school specials in the 80s that were pretty much exactly this, where the parent thought their son was up to no good, but find out, oh, he's just teaching this other boy who can't read how to read. Like, I could see that easily being an after-school special. And it comes off exactly like that. Really goofy, really cheesy, really, like, I said it's heartwarming, but it's kind of in a very obvious way. A way that's not particularly clever, or in a way I think that would feature any, like, what I would call good writing or classic writing. They're just going by the numbers. And again, this plotline in particular is what really has that season 1 feeling to me. Like, this is not something you would see. You wouldn't see these after-school specials in later seasons. In fact, I remember years ago, not that long ago, but maybe a decade or two ago, it was well after this episode came out, and I was just flipping through the channels or something that came across this episode and the scene with the Jake and Nog stuff, which I had forgotten all about. And I was like, oh yeah, I forgot about this. This is why I don't like season 1. Like, it had that, it just reminded me of that cheesiness, because Deep Space Nine had moved on and become so much better in later seasons that, to me, like, people love they love to pick on Move Along Home, which they're wrong to do. It's not as bad as everyone makes it out to be, and they point to that as being the failure of season 1. And again, I'm not saying this is the worst episode of season 1, or even among the worst. It's not. There are much worse coming. But it signifies just how cheesy and poor the writing is in the entire season, with the exception of one episode, which you know what episode I'm talking about. It's just how cheesy the writing is, and that they hadn't really found their footing yet. And honestly, to be fair to season 2, I think they do find it in season 2. Now, season 2 still is a little subpar compared to the other seasons, except for 5. But I think that it's definitely, they got away from this sort of cheesy, subpar feel that I think this subplot here really exemplifies. Not that I totally hate the subplot, again, but yeah, it's just an after school special. There's really nothing else to say about it. So anyway, I would now like to thank my Patreon supporters for supporting me on Patreon. It's very much appreciated. It does help me continue with the channel. I'm very forever grateful. So I'd like to give a big special thanks to Antarius and Brandon Neilhouse. Thank you both so very, very much for your support. And I would also like to give a shout out to Greg Marley, Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Matty Jester, Joel Avals, Alessandro Miguelcio, Norman Buchwald, Stephen Kennedy, Britton Berg, and Allison Fordyce. Thank you all so very much for your support. So we have a few Patreon comments for this episode. First comment is from Kyrie091, who says, the Nagus, more like, I got nothing. But I do want to talk about this episode. Let's be real, Wallace Shawn is a boss. I like the world building of Ferengi. I like how this all sort of builds the Ferengi into what we know them as later, which helps us understand complex characters like Nog and Rom. All the foundation is built up here by exposing us to the Ferengi civilization. Let's see. Oh, Norman Buckwald responds, has a possibility title, more like Stinkus. Well, I tried. No one can beat you with the degrading puns. Fair. Stinkus. The Stinkus. Yeah, not as good. Not as good as Kyrie's 091's puns. But anyway, as far as the world building goes, my issue with how they develop the Ferengi in Deep Space Nine, and this actually gets worse, to be fair, later on, is that they portray them as kind of weak and cowardly, yet which doesn't jive with their appearance in TNG, which they have some like really powerful ships. Like, they have a good military, even if they're not an official organized military, even if they're more like sort of loose pirates, or however you would like to label them. It's still, they could be threatening. Like, they could threaten the Enterprise. They even took over the Enterprise. Don't even get me started on that, though. Just don't. Oh my god. But anyway, like, they have powerful ships, and they could be a huge adversary. And I can kind of see that here, but I think they didn't make that very clear. Like, they didn't make clear their sort of threat. But the way that, for example, that one Ferengi acts with the protection racket, you do get the sense that they can be fearsome. I think my favorite Ferengi episode, ironically, The Magnificent Ferengi, is the one that does the worst job in retconning this and pretending like the Ferengi can't be tough and have a tough military with, like, powerful ships. Anyway, next comment is from Norman Buckwald, who says, so the first Ferengi episode sort of attempts a Godfather type of metaphor. I guess that's one way to steer away that some were accusing Trek of doing of negative Jewish stereotypes. Let's throw in the bad Italian stereotypes. Wallace Shawn does make a nice take of creating the Grand Nagus, and I guess was why he came back. Although he does join Wesley, Neelix, Loxana, and others as annoying characters. By the time we get to the final season where Quark thought he was going to be the Grand Nagus, yes, we have been here before, way once upon a time. I'm sure when Zek told Ishka who he was going to appoint Grand Nagus, maybe Ishka said, wait, what happened to... Oh, we do not speak of him. I guess, for whatever reason. THH, 4 cracks who? Out of 10. I guess Worf is a better parent than Zek or Martok, at least. THH equals Teehee. Teehee. Anyway, and Norman responds to that saying, almost gave it a 5. If an unimpressive episode is a Ferengi episode, it gets an automatic 1-point deduction. THH. Yes, for Ferengi episodes. Yeah, no, so Ishka wasn't like cracks who. She just like had no idea. Like, they just didn't know of his existence because Q or someone just simply like erased him from all existence. Maybe someone went back and traveled in time and made it so Krax wasn't born, and so now we're in an alternate timeline. Some people make videos like that seriously. God, that hurts. That aggravates me so much. But to say it as a joke is fine. Anyway, next comment is from Stephen Kennedy, who says, every time I watch this episode, I always think of dwarves from The Unexpected Party and the masterpiece movie, which is The Godfather. This was David Livingston's first time directing a Deep Space Nine episode, and he wrote it alongside Ira Steven Behr. This episode proves that Rom isn't stupid. He just Deep Space Nine version of Reginald Barclay. We will talk more about Rom in the episode Necessary Evil, which will be a revisited, by the way. But anyway, Jake teaches Nog how to read, and this is the first step for him wanting to join Starfleet, as I think this is the start of his Starfleet dreams. Wallace Shawn, first appearance as Grand Nagus Zek, and I know I'm alone in this. I really enjoy the Ferengi episodes, which is weird as I don't really like comedy programs. So my rating is a 7 out of 10. Yeah, that is really weird if you don't like comedy programs that you like the Ferengi episodes. Although, maybe not so weird because the Ferengi episodes are not funny. But they are intended to be funny, though. I don't know why. Yeah, there's a few people out there who like the Ferengi episodes, but for good reason they are outnumbered by those who don't, because, God, Ferengi episodes suck. It is a blemish on Deep Space Nine as a show. It's such an amazing show, and I always talk about it as one of the great shows. But yeah, one of the blemishes is that they have to come back and do these stupid-ass Ferengi episodes once or twice a year. Now, as for Nog, this being the start of his wanting to join Starfleet, that's a nice little headcanon you got there, but it is completely made up because the writers did not intend for Nog to join Starfleet until the episode in which he announces he wants to join Starfleet. To me, it was a very sloppy retcon, and I know some people will disagree, but I wouldn't say I hate the retcon, because it does make Nog's character more interesting, but he was never meant to be that, and I think that's very obvious, and I think it really obvious in this episode that he had never had any intention of wanting to join Starfleet. And also, speaking of Rom, they retcon his character too, because they really do in seasons 1 and 2 portray him as an idiot. And it's funny because I didn't mention this in my review for Babel, but in that episode, Odo knows that Quark is lying about his replicators being repaired because he said that Rom did it. He's like, Rom's an idiot. He couldn't fix a straw if it was bent. Yet later, Rom is portrayed to be this engineering genius. Now, I know you could come up with the headcanon and excuses that, well, Odo just was wrong and he didn't realize that Rom was a genius. But the real answer is that the writers changed their minds and retconned him into being a genius later on. And I think he is still portrayed as an idiot in this episode, in my opinion. He's just a bit more ruthless of an idiot because he tries to kill Quark. And again, Zek at the end of the episode even points out that what Krax and Rom were doing was stupid, that there was actually a smarter way to do it, so I don't think it is portraying him as particularly smart in this episode. But I'm definitely a lot more negative on Rom and Nog and the Ferengi as a whole than you are. So you can chalk it up to my cynicism. Anyway, next comment is from Antarius, who says, I like how the more comedic A-plot is balanced by the more serious B-plot. The A-plot has some really funny moments, but the scene at the airlock where Quark was almost murdered didn't fit the tone. Can you still like Rom after this scene? I can't believe Rom didn't face any consequences for attempting to murder Quark twice. Even if Quark didn't press any charges, there should still be an indictment by the Bajoran law enforcement authorities. From today's perspective, it's funny that Jake has lots of pads. Seems like Federation pads can save one file only. But the Ferengi pads look even more ridiculous. Who made the choice to appoint O'Brien as the substitute teacher? The poor guy already has more work than he can handle. My rating is a 7 out of 10. Well, you guys are being very generous by giving this episode a 7 out of 10. But anyway, so, yeah, there's a few things I wanted to address. Yeah, the whole thing with Rom. Yes, he should have been charged with attempted murder. Even if Quark didn't press charges, he set off a bomb inside the station. So you're right, the Bajoran authorities could have something to say about that. Or, attempting to throw someone out of an airlock. But I suppose they're using the same logic that they used in Move Along Home when they should have charged Follow with abducting Starfleet officers and putting them through physical pain and mental distress. Yet they just were gave him a stiff finger wag. And so they're applying that same logic to Rom now, the finger wag. Anyway, it's just a sign of bad writing and plot contrivance is what that is. What else? It's funny that Jake has lots of pads. Yeah, no, that is funny. That is actually a very good point. That he should have. And poor O'Brien. Yeah, it doesn't make any sense because they showed him as being so incredibly overwhelmed in Babel. But I think in later episodes, he actually was less overwhelmed. So again, that was plot contrivance for that episode. And plus he had a team, which I don't know why he didn't have one of those in fucking Babel. But apparently Starfleet just finally decided to send him a team by this episode to lighten his workload so he can go be a substitute teacher. Alright, so I just thought of the third funny moment in this episode. Again, I'm going to be totally fair to this episode, which is, for the most part, actively unfunny, and I stand by that. But there is a third moment that was kind of funny, and that's with O'Brien being the teacher and Nog claiming that his pad was stolen by Vulcans. And O'Brien's like, why would Vulcans want to steal your pad? And he's like, because they don't have ethics? Because the lesson was supposed to be about ethics. So, I mean, that wasn't funny. That was more of a giggle. So maybe I'm being too fair to this episode. But it wasn't actively unfunny, to be fair. It was a slight little giggle. But anyway, thank you patrons so much for your comments. So my rating for the Grand Dingus, my rating for the Nagus out of 10 is a 4 poor. And you know what? I'm using the exact same logic that Norman used, because I was considering giving this episode a 5 because it was, somewhat decent, especially when you compare it to other Ferengi episodes. It seems like a masterpiece because, boy, the Ferengi episodes get much worse. But yeah, I gotta downgrade it just because it's so annoying, just because of the dingus and all the other Ferengis being it's just, I don't like it. It annoys me. It's actively unfunny, as I say. And so it gets a 4. Gets downgraded to a 4 poor. Anyway, that is it for my review of the dingus. So coming up on my channel Monday, getting into Die Hard on a starship. And my review for Starship Mine. Wednesday will be my review for Lessons. Thursday, my review for Vortex. And then Saturday, I'll be back over on Patreon doing another revisit, this time revisiting my review for The Chase. So that's what's coming up on my channel. Be sure to check it out as I continue to cover Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Star Trek The Next Generation, and check out my channel as I cover many other videos as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks a lot for watching.